All right. I kind of want to talk about this. I've been wanting to talk about it for a while now. Um, but I wanted to have a conversation about this conversation. Yeah. So, for those of you who don't know, it's about a couple weeks ago. I had a conversation with the Consciously. The conversation is, fully up on here. It was rather long, but the conversation was basically, can you be racist towards white people? And we had a little conversation. So it was supposed to be a nice conversation. It got a little bit out of hand, and I wanted to give you my reflections on it. Right. So let's me start off by stating my perspective. Actually, what I would really like to do is I think that there is a comment in here that was rather good. I'd like to actually showcase this comment if I could zoom in. Okay, so this was actually a pretty good comment. I pinned it because I thought it was pretty good. I think it was a pretty solid representation of it. It says, it seems from the conversation that in George's mind, to be white means to be in power. His reasoning is white people made race and label white to represent those in power, aka themselves. So to not be in power means to not be white, which he literally said. But from my understanding, to Papa, he defines being white as what the dictionary does. Dictionary definitions don't define white people as the ones in power, nor do most people today. The modern definition of white more or less refers to a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa, and having a white skin tone. George's meaning of being white and just race in general is outdated and not only the incorrect definition, but like Papa said, it holds white people to a higher standard which doesn't propagate equality. So according to his argument, in his mind, once white people don't have any power, race basically dissolves itself because in his mind, race is a just hierarchy of power. And that isn't what it is. And that isn't what would necessarily happen. As Papa points out, the whole argument only stems from a disagreement in one word. They both want the same thing. I personally agree. I personally am of the same opinion as Papa regarding this, and I feel George would normally agree too, but he's so deeply rooted in his opinion that seems to be avoiding and overcomplicating, as Papa also points out. There are a lot more complexities in this conversation, but this is just just about that one disagreement with the word white. Overall, I really enjoyed their conversation, and disagreements are fine, and it's hope that they were both really respectful with each other. So I'd say for the most part, we were rather respectful. It just got a bit out of hand. So yeah, I think that pretty accurately sums it up. My perspective is that you can be racist towards white people. Now, and obviously his is that it can't be, and we've already, gone through why. But let me give you a quick, understanding of why we should maintain the idea that you can be racist towards white people. First and foremost, there's nothing that benefits society is claiming otherwise. If you made it so that white people cannot be the victim of racism or victims of racism in any circumstance, what you're effectively doing is saying that white people are held to a higher standard based on the way that they interact with other people, but they're also demonized in our society, right? Now, we can certainly and absolutely acknowledge systemic racism as something that white people do not experience as today in society. 100%, and we can still maintain the same idea. We can contextualize the idea that if you are a white person who is racist, for instance, there is basically the reason for your racism as a white person, generally speaking, is going to be simply because you think that white people are superior. And there may be also a level of impact based on the stereotypes that are created due to systemic racism, right? So white people some racists embrace the idea that white people or black people are inferior. And one of those is like, well, look at their crime rates, or look at their culture and whatnot. And now I come from the perspective of in the specific poor black communities, which isn't all poor black communities or even all black communities, that type of culture, that type of gang or violence culture is stemming from lack of opportunity and even societal oppression in the past, or really governmental oppression more than that. Flip that on the other side, when it comes to a black person that's racist, generally speaking, it's going to be from that version of oppression. So you could say that generally speaking, black people are more justified in their oppression. It's very much the same thing as, the reasoning for being, it's really just coming down to contextualizing the reason that people are the way that they are. But we can maintain that contextualization without completely removing white people from being the victims. At no point was I even suggesting that we should reframe this terminology to make it so that more violence against black people towards white people should be posed as racist. Simply put, I'm just trying to make sure that we maintain equality. Because moving forward, if we do what I would like to do, which is create equality in our society, the power dynamic from white to black is going to shift. And that's really going to happen due to like equity. I mean, we need to figure out a way to create a better, poverty floor to allow people to jump off of it, but that's a conversation for another day. The goal is to slowly shift the power dynamic and really the money dynamic so that everybody's equal. If you make it so that white people cannot be the victims of, or rather white people, cannot be the victims of racist attacks from any other person, as that power dynamic shifts, white people will start to be considered less than, because again, it sets a standard that white people are inherently, honestly, they're demonized from just inherently. Now, consciously actually brought up to an extent. There was a quick conversation about how he thinks that the colonization and slavery of white people is worse than the colonization and slavery of literally every other civilization that's existed. For context, every civilization has, used colonization and slavery. And he really did reinforce his idea that he thinks that white people are inherently more barbaric. Now, I agreed to it in that moment, but honestly, thinking back, I don't know why I did. I don't really think that's true. I think that we harp too heavily on skin color when it's one of hundreds of different identities that we have. They're very irrelevant. The only reason, in my opinion, that white people were able to colonize and the world better is simply because we were born in places with better access to resources that allowed us to do these things. We were born in more, temperamental climates, where black people were born in not so temperamental climates, right? That's why the skin is black, basically because the sun is hotter and the sun was colder, or not the sun wasn't hotter, but the area was hotter. Whereas my areas where my ancestors were born, it was colder because, they didn't have, that's why they had white skin, and the resources that were around there were better, that were just better for allowing us to create more technological advancements. That's it. So yeah. I think my biggest problem wasn't the disagreement. It was the fact that he wasn't really open to a conversation. The one thing that I never heard him say, and it was, I understand what you're saying, but I disagree. I don't think he ever understood. I think that he thinks that somehow when the power dynamic does ultimately shift and we are ultimately all equal, he thinks that the idea of race simply exists. But the reality is that we all subscribe to the concept of race in every country, and every person does it. Even black people. There are, Native Black Americans have racist interactions with what we call non-Native Black Americans, like Haitian people and Nigerian people, though they don't like to be called black, because of racism. People see differences. Tribalism is very much something that we are born with. We are all very tribalistic in many ways, and we all gravitate towards people who are similar to ourselves. So the concept of race doesn't disappear when white people aren't in power. It's not Harry Potter. There's no Horcrux that makes racism disappear. We all subscribe to the concept of it, and I think that it's a very ignorant worldview to suggest otherwise. Moving on from there was a conversation that we had about Western culture versus, I guess we'll call it Eastern culture or Middle Eastern cultures. And I had suggested the idea that Western civilization, I think, is the greatest civilization. It's flawed, but we're actually working on our flaws. This can be seen in the way that we have, we're very progressive when it comes to the relations of a lot of marginalized groups. Now, America, I would say, is the least progressed Western society. It needs to do better, but overall Western civilization is better. We compared that to the Middle Eastern countries, and he simply put, completely ignored it. He thinks that, and he brought up one particular argument that sat very poorly with me. I took it in good faith, but this is one of the reasons why I was very frustrated afterwards. He mentioned the idea that it is legal in the United States, in 11 states, to rape your spouse. Meanwhile, right, so that's what he mentioned. And he even suggested that it wasn't that way in the Middle East, although maybe I didn't press him hard enough on it. Looking into it, though, there is 0 states in the United States where it's legal to rape your spouse. It's completely illegal. There are states that have laws that don't ban it, but like they're protected by federal law. So he's emphatically incorrect. In fact, but in every single Middle Eastern country, it is legal to rape your wife. I asked him at one point, would you rather be a woman in the United States or over in Pakistan? And he said, he tried to make it seem like they were better, or that they were equal in different ways. The reality is that it's not. You're better off being a woman in the United States than any Middle Eastern country. He mentioned that there are female leaders. That's great. But again, based off of the thing that we had just talked about, which effectively is rape culture and marital rape, you're better off being a woman in Western society. In fact, you're better off being anything in Western society, even gay or LGBT. They're objectively more accepting of LGBT members in the United States. Again, we're not there yet, but that is a fact, and it's a factor. Moving forward, and this actually mixes with another point. We had talked about slavery, and I had one point I made the argument that in the United States, white people are trying to shift the power dynamic, because if we weren't, there would be no shift. Slavery would have never ended. Segregation would have never ended if white people weren't trying to become equal or trying to shift the power dynamic. He completely rejected it and said the only reason that black people are equal in America is because they took it. The reality is that there's no way that any small group, any minority group, could ever just take power from the majority. And my point simply is that white people, or people, just want equality. They just don't understand the inequality of America. That's pretty much it. He rejects this idea. I at one point asked him if he would rather be he said that there's slavery today, which is true, but I asked him if he'd rather be black now or 200 or 300 years ago, and he said that it's just as bad now in America for black people than it was back in the day when slavery was very much legal. Very ignorant. In my opinion. We then move on to actually a mixture of points about modern day slavery. There are 400,000 modern day slaves in America with a population of 330 million. Specifically in Pakistan, there are 3.2 million modern day slaves with a population of 212 million. That's huge. Most of those are actually women and children who are sex slaves, or I think a quarter of them are children, but most of those are sex slaves. Again, not only reinforcing that America is better when it comes to slavery, but also that Middle Eastern countries, still are not only worse in slavery, but just overall worse to live in, and they're not as free as countries in America, especially for people who are not in power, which you would call men, right? So those are my reflections. I think he is he's much more interested in debating than having honest conversations. I think he's very lost in the theory of race. And I think that it is not a positive thing. At the end of the day, I want to kind of end off with this one point about racism and about systemic racism. Not all black people are the victims of systemic racism. Okay? And when we look at something like, what was it called? Affirmative action, which attempts to reverse systemic racism in the United States, I think that it's done a job of doing it, not a bad job. But when you generalize a group of people, it actually has a negative impact overall. And the reason I say this is because think about it. Non-native black Americans, Haitian, Nigerian migrants from Africa coming over here, they're poor, but they're very hardworking, and they work very hard, and they make good, they work hard for their livings here, but they also benefit from affirmative action. And the reason that this is a bad thing, kind of, is because it makes it so that there's a quota for black people, but not for people who really need help being freed from systemic racism, which are people who are descendants of slavery in the United States. And this is the problem with overly generalizing everything. This is overly generalizing all of our identities leads to a very poor attempt at reducing the marginalization of individual people, right? Yes, they can still be affected by systemic racism, but honestly, I not nearly to the same extent. I think that our perception of systemic racism nowadays, for the most part, it's illegal. Systemic racism is illegal. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I come from more the perspective that systemic racism doesn't necessarily exist in the way that we think. It more exists in the impact that it's had in the past that we still haven't reversed now. That's where I come from more than anything else. I genuinely don't think that migrants from other countries are going to be victims of systemic racism nearly to the extent as people who are here. Of course, we could have conversations about implicit bias, but again, overall, native black Americans, especially the descendants of slaves that live in these very poor black communities that don't have opportunity, are absolutely more impacted by systemic racism than immigrants that come right over from another country. And so that's kind of what I want to end with, is basically I think that we generalize too much, and to move forward, we really need to destroy the concept of race. And the only way to destroy the concept of race is really to not, is to stop focusing on race. Stop focusing on color. Now, of course, we need to contextualize people's histories. 100%. I agree with that. I understand that. And that means that we cannot completely abolish the concept of race yet. But we need to be making solid, positive steps forward in order to remove the concept of race and to abolish it. And the only way to do that is by setting equal standards for everybody. And that's why you should be able to be the target of racism as a white person, even if we shouldn't increase or expand the situations where it happens, right? I'm not saying that we need to make it so that white people, that any action against a white to black person or black to white person needs to be considered racism. I'm simply saying we need to maintain these standards of equality as we move forward to not demonize people. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say with that. That's what I wanted to say with that, guys. How you like that? Bleach your skin. Yeah, right. That's terrible. Don't do that.
Now I'm panicking.
I have a serious issue. Since Trump lost, I have to retire my Trump 2020 flag, but now there is a blank space on my wall. I think a
that'd be cool.
2032 flag would look really nice there.
How would I make a Papa 2032 flag? How the hell would I do that? Oh yeah. Okay, hold on a second. Yeah, no. Let me kind of finish that off. I forgot about that. You did mention that. Yeah, there was a moment in the conversation where he tried to frame me as a white supremacist by saying, "Oh, every single thing that I say is just like the same things as white supremacists say when they talk about white black people getting power." Honestly, it was intentionally. It was intentionally demonizing me to try to diminish my perspective. I never said that black people shouldn't be equal. I'm simply saying we should create equal standards. There is absolutely no white supremacist in the entire world who would ever suggest that we need to reverse systemic racism. There's no white supremacist in the world who actually wants there to be equality of black and white people. I'm not a white supremacist. The fact that he called me that is honestly really is the reason why at the end of this whole thing, it made me realize that Consciously truly is a racist individual who is incredibly lost in theory. So yeah, yeah. I want to say thank you so much, guys, to all my Patreons, and a special shout out to my Papa XL Patreons. Without all you guys, I would just be some fat dude screaming into a microphone. So thank you so much, guys. Mwah, I love you all. I want Papa Gut to pee on my face, but just as a friend. There's nothing weird about that. I want him to pee on my face.